and welcome to episode 33 of the Anthrozoology podcast. I'm Michelle Sadlowski, an anthrozoologist focused on pachyderm-human relations, pachyderm conservation, and the ways in which humans use language to control the narrative of other than human animal lives.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I completed my PhD in Anthrozoology last year, and my research focus is on cat-human relations and discourses surrounding roaming cats.
Hi, my name's Sarah Oxley-Heaney. I'm a PhD candidate with the University of Exeter, and I'm looking at shark-human relationships. I'm also very interested in the feline lives of Saudi cats, especially the abandonment of cats.
Today, we're continuing our special series on the history and future of the field of anthrozoology, and we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Lynette Hart. Dr. Hart is the Department Vice Chair and Professor of Population Health and Reproduction in the School of Veterinary Medicine at UC Davis. Her research focuses on human, other than human animal interactions, animal behavior, and welfare. She's also one of the founders of the field of anthrozoology and the International Society for Anthrozoology, also known as ISAZ, as well as the recipient of the ISAZ Distinguished Anthrozoologist Award for Outstanding Lifetime Achievement. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hart.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
Today, we're talking about our examination of the past, the present, and the future of the field with those who are really responsible for building the field of anthrozoology. So maybe we could just start with you giving us a little bit of background on how you got involved in the field and sort of the foundations of the group that's now ISAZ.
Great. Well, my first career was school teaching, 7th and 8th grade in California. And I did that, science and math, for 5 years while I was also getting a master's degree at UC Berkeley in education psychology. I thought I'd be a school psychologist, but I took a course from Gerald McLaren, who was just beginning his work in behavior genetics. He had us looking at 5 different strains of mice, gathering data in different testing situations, analyzing the data and presenting them. And I was totally hooked. It was just intoxicating. So I said, oh, well, when I get my PhD, it's going to be in behavior. So I did a behavior PhD at Rutgers University studying rat ultrasonic vocalizations during mating. And Donald Griffin, many of you'll know his name, actually was very friendly in loaning us a bat detector from Rockefeller that made that possible. So that was my start. But then when I moved to California in 1982, there were just the first glimmerings of interest in human-animal interactions. And at that time, there were back-to-back conferences in Minnesota and California where presentations were made. And I ended up editing those presentations. So it was just the right time to jump into this field. There was no field, but it was the right time to start working in it. And so then I always kept these 2 areas side by side, the behavior and the human-animal interactions. There was no field. So all of us who were working in this area or doing research in the area were just doing it out of our side pockets. And everyone except Erica Friedman was working in animal behavior or animal ecology. So that's where we came from. And that's very different than what's happening today, where people are generally coming from the human health side.
So during that time, you mentioned yourself and you mentioned Erica. As you looked around, what was the distribution of females in the field versus males in the field?
Yeah, well, it was just Erica and me and the men, because there weren't that many women with positions. And it was pretty miraculous that my position opened up, because in 1990, I was hired to direct a Center for Animal Alternatives, which was UC-wide. And that only came up because the legislature became very militant for animal welfare, and they were really opposed to building a new lab animal facility at UC Berkeley. So the state legislature said, you can only build this new facility at UC Berkeley if you open a center to address animal alternatives. And if you know the national history, 1985 was a huge watershed year for passing the Animal Welfare Act and also requiring compliance with the Guide to the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. I mean, we had this major, very definitive crackdown on how we deal with animals in research. It was very specific with requirements. That was 85, hammered from every angle. And so that was still resonating around the country. And that part of that was what happened in California, saying you've got to have an alternative center. So that made a position available. And I really prepared for that application process. And I was the only applicant that didn't already have a tenured position, but I was selected. So that it was kind of an accident that I got a faculty position. The other faculty positions of the founders were supported in odd ways. So if you go through the list of them, this isn't true for Ben. Ben was a real behavior hire. But Dennis Turner was getting a lot of support from the pet food industry, as was James Serple, as was John Bradshaw. And then James came to Philadelphia and had a bequest that supported him in an endowed chair. And Alan Beck, who didn't stay that much with ISAZ, but was one of the leaders, really. Alan was also in an endowed chair. So the money was coming from bequests and the pet food industry. Very unusual field in that way, the funding, and as you've already talked about and you know about.
Do you think that that has changed a lot? Because I know as far as anthrozoology itself, like if you are titled as an anthrozoologist, typically you are actually falling under different headings, right? You're in a psychology department or you're in an anthropology department. So do you think that that's sort of improved at all for people being, you know, funded as human-animal interaction researchers, or do you think it's still pretty much funded in a lot of strange ways?
It's still a combination. When I was thinking about this podcast, I went through and kind of looked at what's going on. And as you know, there's all kinds of new academic programs all over the place. There are many online programs offering certificates. And I think the certificates are kind of an indication, a reflection that anthrozoology isn't its own disciplinary field. It doesn't generally have a department with, there's a couple exceptions, but mostly it's an add-on. It's a big enhancement to your work in psychology or ecology or behavior or biology, whatever. And so, and this is a key point, the general public is extremely interested in these kinds of things. It's always been, from the beginning, it's always been a bottom-up movement, I would say. It was driven by people in every community in the 1980s taking their pets into nursing homes. They knew it was a great thing. They wanted to do it. Well, that's still happening. And so that's why you can offer these certificate programs. There's 4 different certificate programs in the state of Pennsylvania at different schools. How can that be? One of them has no credit offered. People just pay because they care about getting this knowledge. So people are so interested in this field. So then that the universities look at that and they say, oh, here's an economic opportunity. And Canisius found that people would throng and join and enroll. Tufts was did an early master's program in animals and public policy. So it's an economic opportunity. So then that leads to positions being offered. So it's very complex, but the pet food industry is still highly involved. as Hal Herzog talked about. It's just a unique area. But lots of schools are really offering anthrozoology positions, and University of Arizona has taken it on, and they're going to have the most people working in that area of any school. In the early days, everyone except Erica was at a veterinary school. Veterinary schools were the home for people doing work in anthrozoology, but no one wanted to pay for that work. So it was paid for in the ways I already described. So they loved it, but they didn't want to pay for it. And these days, what's happened is we've had other professionals rising up. So now we have initiatives out of the professional area of social work and initiatives out of the area of psychology. So professionals are getting involved, as well as still having a strong interest from the general public. It's still true that the veterinary profession provides great leadership in all kinds of things pertaining to animals. So, for example, if you look at the only a few laws that we have, federal laws pertaining to animals, there's a whole big gray area where there aren't any laws. And that's somewhat filled by the professional voice of the veterinary community, because they have over 100 policies. And those policies reflect a consensus from the veterinary profession. And AVMA works very hard to create consensus positions. And that's like an authoritative statement about what the best practice is regarding animals. So kind of it becomes almost a quasi-legal statement that they're making. And I think I'm kind of unique in the extent to which I've been involved with the veterinary profession, although not a vet. So all these people at vet schools who do this kind of work, almost none of them is ever a vet. One exception would be Ben, another would be Daniel Mills, another would be Anthony Podbersak, but you could almost put them on one hand. So it's PhDs like me who do the research. So that's a kind of quirky thing too. And for various reasons, I've always been very involved in the vet profession and given lectures at vet schools and to vets. And I'm on the SCI committee, that's Steering Committee on Human-Animal Interactions. That's the most freewheeling committee of AVMA that has the power to create new initiatives to solve problems. And I'm just wrapping up my second 3-year term. So that group responds to issues that veterinarians are facing, like a major concern right now is humane endings, how veterinarians deal with the sad humane endings of animals, whether it's companion animals or animals in slaughter or animals in depopulation situations where you have to kill thousands of chickens in 2 days or something like that. So that's been a major concern of the vet profession.
I think the veterinary profession has also sort of come forward in the whole animal grieving process, right? Allowing for that grief process for our companion animals, or a grief process for, I guess, ourselves in the things that sometimes we're forced to do.
Totally. So I watched that up very close, because in the 1980s, we put together the first pet loss support group sponsored by a veterinary association here in Sacramento Valley. And it was led by a clinical psychologist. It met a couple times a month, and her rates were paid for by the Veterinary Association. Almost no one came, but we had constant media attention. The media loved it. And whenever we would talk with anyone, they would say, I don't need to go to the group, but I'm so happy it's there for people who need it. And when we started this in the mid-1980s, we printed beautiful brochures for vets to put in their clinics. None of the vets put the brochures out in view, even the ones at our vet school, because they thought they could tell which clients would be upset when their animal was in decline. And so they kept it under the counter, and they would occasionally hand one to someone. Well, of course, that wasn't a good thing. And it took a few years before finally the message got through. This is really important. People are grieving. You have to admit to the public that animals die at your practice. We have to get through that barrier. And it was just a short time, we had the pet loss support line going with vet students responding to calls after special training, because we were getting contacted from all over the country from people who were grieving. So I would say the profession changed in that regard almost overnight, so quickly. It really started embracing, in a matter of 10 years, it had really changed. And you could go to a conference, veterinary conference, and see all kinds of products related to animal death, things you could send to your clients, cards, ways of taking a paw print or doing something with the animal's fur, or, various things like that. So it changed quickly. The initial attention was on veterinary clients, but by now it's really shifted to the veterinarians and the stress that they experience, as you know, about the suicide rate.
Yes, so this is something we've talked about before, that anthrozoology is predominantly focused on companion animals, and my interests are in cats, companion animals. And yeah, that makes sense because of the funding from the pet food industries, etc. But it's also, I think, because our companion animals are the animals that we can really relate to. And when I say we, I mean sort of urban humans that are sort of urban humans. So that's sort of our first real sort of experience that we can relate to with other than human animals. But I wonder sort of what your thoughts are on sort of moving into wildlife. It's predominantly, study of wildlife is predominantly from a conservationist ecology angle. But I've noticed this sort of coming up time and time again in various conversations, that students, biology students, ecology, wildlife students, they also want to know about this human-animal interaction side. So they're getting very much a population type curriculum and the sort of conventional conservation education. But there seems to be a real interest in human wildlife interactions on that individual level. So I wonder what your thoughts are, if you've sort of seen more and more of this field picking up in anthrozoology, or is it sort of merging into the ecology departments? Have you noticed any more trends towards human wildlife interactions?
I can speak about my own personal experience to start with. Mm-hmm. And also the founders, that most of us who were founders had a very broad interest in all kinds of animals, relationships with all kinds of animals. I mean, James Serpell would be a paragon of that kind of emphasis if you look at his knowledge of animals in general. So that's our personal viewpoint, and that was our commitment with launching the journal Anthrozoos, that it be a very broad view of human-animal interactions of all types. And for myself, I started with animal behavior, and I carried on with that. So the majority of my students have been doing animal behavior studies with things like elephants or bison or whatever it was of interest. So I have a very inclusive view myself. But as Hal mentioned, it's a kind of a takeover, not a takeover really, but there's just a flood of people who are so interested in animal-assisted therapy, wanting to deliver their therapy dogs to people in a more general way. So there's a lot more people interested in doing that. So we just need to keep students aware and get the word out, because it's alarming to me that students still aren't that aware that there is such a field. And whenever I give a lecture on our campus, like to our animal science students or animal biology students, their mouths are always dropping open, that they don't realize there's this expansive area that is so broad that where they could be working with a variety of species of animals.
Which brings me on very nicely to my question, which was, you say about people caring about getting this knowledge and you know, in human-animal interactions, and I'm not sure whether you're speaking about the general public as well as people who are in academia. So throughout your time involved with probably people asking you about where to get this knowledge, have you seen a change in species requests? For example, was when you first started, was it were people asking to get knowledge about specific species, and now that's expanded? Plus, my last question about this is, what species do you not see covered that you would create the same excitement as you that you experienced when you were learning about genetics, that you would like to see more research on?
I think in the video that I watched of you, I think it was Chris who said, there's so much that hasn't been studied. That's just the truth. And that was what I was always thinking about when I was going to Africa or India. What are the simple questions that we don't know anything about? So I guess my plea for people, especially for students and new faculty, is to be really conscious and aware and alert to opportunities, because the opportunities that are available are always evolving and changing, and that affects what is possible to do easily. And so we had great opportunities with our teaching schedules. Ben and I could leave every summer and go for 6 weeks or something to any country in Africa, and we would leave the country that was getting politically difficult and move on to another one. So kept moving around the world in that way and asking questions. What do we not know anything about? We don't know anything about how flamen is performed by antelope. We don't know anything about how antelope groom. Really simple, basic behaviors. We could teach someone in half a day how to drive a Suzuki Jeep and go out with someone in the car to do observations for 15 minutes on each animal and publish work on that. So that kind of cherry picking opportunity, I'm sure there are opportunities like that remaining, but people have to be looking for what those are. So it's not that I would, a certain species I would like to see more, but just more observations of basic behavior that isn't known about. One of my students studied squirrels, and she was just doing observations in the wild, and we always did just basic observations, usually without any intervention, or often without any intervention. So that's really a plea to look at special opportunities. And we were able to do this at no cost by leading sort of Earthwatch type adventures for people. We happened to work through University of California for a while. Then we worked through Wilderness Travel. Volunteers would pay enough to cover our expenses, and we could get away from the university. So we gathered piles of data with our group of 9 people, 2 different sessions. And every summer we could get plenty of data for a study.
That sounds fascinating. I wish I could join you on one of those expeditions going across Africa and just saying, look at that, look at that. It'd be amazing. Absolutely. Thank you.
I think that's one of the things that I find so exciting about your past, is that you've looked at these, you know, rat sexual behavior and service dogs and pet effects on health and you know, squirrel trapping and all these very different things, which is very much, you know, what I think a lot of us who look at this field of anthrozoology or burgeoning field of anthrozoology are interested in many different things. So there's no longer that sort of field that you have to specialize in only one, right? There's a breadth of species we could look at. And I wonder if you could maybe comment a little bit on collaboration in this area. You know, we write a lot collaboratively with people in different areas, and we found it to be very beneficial. And since you've co-authored and done studies with so many people, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you developed those collaborations and how they were beneficial to all parties, and sort of some advice maybe for newer people in science looking to build those collaborations.
Oh, that's a great question, Michelle. Well, one secret is that I've always collaborated with a librarian. I love librarians. They're service-oriented. They just want to help you find what you need. And so I worked with David Anderson for a number of years, and I kept recalling him from retirement, and then he was gone, and I hired Mary Wood, and she eventually retired, and now I'm working with Eric Bossack. I mean, they are the best people because they're so connected, and I would have them come in and give a lecture at the beginning of my course on human-animal interactions. So the students would have a requirement to review a paper, and they would first have a lecture from a librarian about how to find the literature, because it is spread all over the place. When we started, it was really spread all over the place, and things were not computerized. It was so interdisciplinary. And it was David Anderson who developed something called the Interactions Bibliography that he edited for 10 years. It came out every month, and he provided titles and abstracts of all the literature. He developed the keywords that became the central keywords for the field. He really helped define the field. David played a major role in that. So definitely librarians are a big key. A second big key for me has been working with students. I just find it really exciting to work with students, and I never tire of that. So that's why when we have really two kinds of professors in my mind. There's the one that has the big line of research, and they're developing this line. They're going to get everything about it, and they find a new student to finish this little branch over here and another one for this branch over here. But then there's the one that has no really central single area, but has more general interest. That's like me. So students would arrive, and they were usually somewhat quirky, unusual in their interests, and they would usually have a very specific interest, and I'd say, do that. So that's why you'll see such a range of topics, collaborating with the student, guiding them to someone, to other people that can help them develop what they want, going to their field site with them, helping them out with that. That's really valuable. And then I've always collaborated with a statistician. I never learned R. I worked with simple statistics myself, and I worked with Neil Willits for quite a few years. And even our research manager has really exceptional statistical skills. So that's kind of been my pattern all the way through. And now that I'm retiring soon, I'm still doing summer projects with veterinary students. We have summer funding that students can apply for to go do some kind of international project. And I had like 4 of them found their way to me last year, and they all got funded. They all went to Asian countries. They were all interested in cats, so that'll be good for Sarah. And also for Chris, they were interested to find out what's different in these Asian countries. What are challenges that people are encountering? How do they get their cat to the vet? And how do they deal with being on the 20th floor of an apartment building? All those kinds of things. And this summer, again, I have another, I think it's 4 more students They're not all in Asia. They're not all doing cats, but those collaborations are just really exciting to me because they lead in new directions that could never be anticipated. And probably the main collaboration that would be a good example to mention is that my career started in human-animal interactions by studying socializing effects of service dogs. And we did quite a few studies with that. And then I sort of moved on to other things. But along the way, an old friend from Japan contacted me and said, my best student is available and can she come do a postdoc? So Mariko Yamamoto came to Davis for just about 5 years. And so she was passionate for service dogs. How could she make those more accessible in Japan? That's what she wanted to learn about. She backed off of the electrophysiological work that she had been doing. She was much more interested in making service dogs accessible. So, well, we went back and started doing that. And I'm going to say one other big thing, which relates to the interest of the general public. I've always just followed questions that are really fun and interesting to me. Well, lots of times those are fun and interesting to the general public too. And many of them have been non-budget studies. So I've been looking over my papers just from the last review period. We had a paper on AIDS survivors. We had a paper on dogs' responses to noise and how difficult that is for dogs. And then, of course, all the spay-neuter work. Well, these papers are in the 99th percentile for public attention. And those 3 papers were conducted with no budget, 0. They were web studies, but they were answering questions, important questions that people really care about. So it's a very kind of different approach, but it's addressing societal needs.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Anthrozoology podcast. And thank you especially to our special guest, Dr. Lynette Hart. Any references mentioned within this episode can be found in our show notes. And please join us for episode 34, where we continue our conversation with Dr. Lynette Hart.